the church was loved by the people, the church was powerful. But we hit the Titanic with modern society.
Well, you know, we were children of our time and of our Western civilization, and we certainly consider that our civilization was superior to others.
I think Oblates came here with good intentions, but the missionary attacked the very soul of the native people.
In this wild land, two worlds collided. A handful of Catholic missionaries embarked on a controversial mission that changed Canada's north and them forever. They are the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. Both worlds will pay a price for the divine imperative that drives God's explorers to the ends of the earth as they go forth to baptize all nations. The founder of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate is Eugene de Maisonneuve. He is a man of fire whose passion for God provides the spark that would ignite a Christian flame. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate are formed on the heels of the French Revolution in 1826. With the church in disarray, Eugene de Maisonneuve sees a need to rebuild the Catholic faith. Today, there are Oblate missionaries in almost 70 countries, spread over 5 continents. In December of 1995, they gather in Rome for a grand ceremony as Eugene de Maisonneuve is crowned a saint at St. Peter's Basilica.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Eugene de Maisonneuve has inspired thousands to follow in the footsteps of the apostles.
An oblate receives his cross on the day he makes his final vows. Evangelizare pauperibus, the actual motto of the Oblates. We are sent to evangelize the poor. There is no greater love than to give your life. The Oblates means the offering of your life. It actually comes from the Latin word, which means the offering of your whole life. Oblatum.
This vision is at the core of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate.
To be a missionary means to go beyond the boundaries, to go where nobody else goes. And that would explain to some extent the meaning of how we came to be here in the first place.
I think they were convinced they were doing God's work. Now, without that type of belief, I don't think these people would have spent, some of them will put 50 years in some of the most isolated missions, living in the most terrible conditions, deprived of, everything that we take for granted. They would say that this was the most noble of all occupations. That one couldn't find anything that was more sublime because one was following in the footsteps of the apostles.
In the 19th century, the missionary fires are fueled by the conviction that Canada is the devil's playground. The New World beckons, waiting to be reconquered for God. The Oblates are armed with an intolerant theology.
It's the theology of people who feel they are an oppressed minority and they're out to defend themselves. They feel that dangers are everywhere. They don't trust the human being. The human being is someone that has to be protected against himself.
The Oblates of Mary Immaculate draw men with passion and an appetite for adventure. They're a different breed, mavericks with a big streak of independence and determination. The first Oblates arrive in Montreal in 1841. 4 years later, they travel west. Bishop Joseph Norbert Provencher of Red River needs men who are tough, missionary men, who will stay and fight to establish the Catholic religion on the frontier. One of the first to arrive on Bishop Provencher's doorstep is Alexander Taché, causing the bishop to remark, "I asked for a man, but they sent me a boy." Alexander Taché comes from Quebec and a family of doctors, explorers, and parliamentarians, but nothing could prepare him for this life.
The foreign missions, as they referred to them, were so new that it was a kind of, well, it would be like a battlefield commission. You send them out there and it's a kind of a sink or swim. And most of them adapted very well.
The young Father Taché thrives on the battlefield, traveling by canoe deep into the heart of Indian country. He tackles his job of evangelizing the Indians with gusto, learning their language and customs. Alexander Taché is quickly promoted from foot soldier to commander as the man in charge of the Catholic frontier. In letters to his mother, he reveals an unusual sensitivity towards the Indians and an appreciation of their culture. He writes,
"All the Indians are better naturalists. A 14-year-old Indian knows the names of all the animals, birds, fishes of his country, and also the instincts, food and habits. I am more ignorant than a young savage."
Today, Alexander Taché is regarded as the father of the Catholic Church in Western Canada.
I have a great deal of respect and admiration for Taché, you know, having read his correspondence, having studied his history, having looked at his work, because he always showed, in my view, he always showed sound judgment. He was a very pragmatic person. I mean, he wouldn't get carried away with some idealistic notion when he knew it didn't work. He knew how to get along with people. He wasn't a biased person.
But there was one group that even Bishop Taché couldn't get along with: the Protestants. In the middle of the wilderness, an age-old rivalry quickly turns into a race to the Arctic Ocean.
That tends to emerge, you see, after the 1840s, when they begin racing to get to the Indians first, because they all understood that the first missionary who's present among a band or nation of Indians is going to probably keep the loyalty of that group of Indians for years afterwards. So the idea was to get there first.
Henri Grolier leads the charge north to the Mackenzie Valley. He's young and abrasive, and convinced his God is superior. Father Grolier proves to be fearless, surviving the wilderness on a diet of Catholic zeal.
Grolier was a cantankerous character, a difficult character who was not easy to get along with. I mean, he tended to provoke people.
Henri Grolier provokes everyone he meets, from officials with the Hudson's Bay Company to his own missionary colleagues. He is consumed by a religious fervor He writes Bishop Taché.
What is lacking in our missions is the blood of martyrs. I believe that an Englishman and a savage are perfectly identical. I truly believe that in all justice, God must have England broken by France.
He was a guy who took his job seriously. He would, brook no interference from anybody, and he was convinced that he was obeying a higher law and that this would justify his actions.
Henri Grelier establishes a string of missions in just 6 years. It's a stunning accomplishment, especially given the fact he suffers from severe asthma. The effort leaves him exhausted. In 1864, he dies at just 38 years of age. But Father Grelier accomplished what he set out to do by establishing a Catholic beachhead in the Mackenzie Valley. He's buried at Fort Good Hope, one of the last missions he founded near the Arctic Circle. Years later, the life of Henri Grelier would be glorified on film. The cantankerous asthmatic was portrayed as a hero. This rare footage was used in Europe to raise awareness and money for the frontier missions. The Oblates would soon earn a reputation for being the specialists of the most difficult missions. In Europe, the work of the Oblates is regarded as noble.
A number of people, I guess, expect a missionary to be perfect, and they never were, and they're not, and so they shouldn't be expected to perform like angels. They're human beings; they have foibles and faults, and consequently, people have to deal with them.
Isolation, hardship, and even starvation are constant companions in the remote north. The missionaries might not see a fellow oblate for months, even years. Into this world steps Emile Petitot. He is the son of a watchmaker from France, with a thirst to explore the unknown and a genius for languages and mapmaking.
Petitot, I understand him to be, he was an immature young man, on the other hand, very intelligent, brilliant. His scholarly reputation that he established at the time, I think, demonstrates that. His preparation of textbooks on Indian languages, his sense of exploration, he was dynamic, he was energetic. So Petitot was, sort of larger than life in many ways.
Father Petitot's gift for languages is one of his lasting contributions. He painstakingly develops a dictionary of northern languages, now regarded as one of the finest recordings of Denis culture and language from this period of history. The dynamic genius with a scholarly reputation is troubled, though. Conditions in the north can try the mettle of any individual, no matter how dedicated. Emile Petitot lives on the edge.
Well, obviously, he became mad. He became a raving lunatic at times, as reported by one of his missionary colleagues. There's detailed reports about his, for example, trying to assassinate someone with an axe, or running around. Here we're talking the lower Mackenzie River, Good Hope, where it's extremely cold in December or January, 40 below, and he's running around outside naked.
Father Petitot's superiors become troubled over his behavior. He's sent back to France, but many more will follow. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate forge ahead, building a Catholic world from scratch. One of the key architects is Vitel Grandin. Vitel Grandin is an unlikely recruit to the priesthood. He has a speech impediment, and he's plagued by ill health. The Seminary for Foreign Missions in Paris declares him to be unfit for missionary work. But he persists, and ultimately is taken in by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He eventually becomes the bishop in charge of the northern missions. Bishop Grandin works all the time, despite chronic ear infections and a bad back.
If you look at the hardships that people endured, if you read the life of, let's say, Bishop Grandin, in whose office we're sitting here right now, I mean, an incredible man. One native person, a Chippewan woman, who made the comment to him at one point, since you are so good, God must be so good. And actually chose as his motto as a bishop, God chooses the weak of this world for his plans. And on his shield, he had the broken reed leaning towards the cross. Now that says a lot about the man, and it doesn't at all suggest, that he's coming here to conquer the world, He comes here very, very humbly.
The humble bishop with the bad back is also the inspiration behind the residential school system, a system that would become an important building block in the Oblates' new society. This is the land of the Denis in Canada's Northwest Territories. The Mackenzie River flows north through this land to the Arctic Ocean. The Denis call it the Croteau, the Great River. Joa Boots lives in the heart of the country that the Oblates of Mary Immaculate set out to conquer for God. His contact with the missionaries offers a rare glimpse into the past. When Joa was a small child, the Oblates came here and planted the seeds of Catholicism in his heart, where they've taken root and grown ever since. Here in the middle of the wilderness, along the river that the Denis call the Croteau, Joa has built a shrine to Jesus. Most of what Joa knows about the gospel is self-taught. The missionaries never stayed in one place for very long, but they would bring Bibles written in syllabics and leave them behind. Syllabics is a phonetic alphabet and easier to learn than English. Joa doesn't speak English, only Slavey, which is a Denis language. He's joined by his friend Nick Sibiston, who helps translate.
He says he recognizes that the missionaries use the Bible and they have their way of praying. He says, well, he doesn't really know that. He knows some elementary or basic stuff that he's learned from learning syllabics and reading about God and Jesus Christ. But he says he prays according to his own Denis belief in God and a Creator.
Joa doesn't know much about organized religion. He's always lived in the bush, where his belief in God and Jesus remains strong and pure.
He says that's his father, and he really he says it makes him cry because he loves God so much, and he just loves God so much. And also they killed him too, so he makes him cry when he thinks about that.
Over time, the word of the gospel spreads through the land of the Denis. Father Rene Fumoleau has followed in the footsteps of the missionary pioneers, learning the language and preaching the gospel much like those who went before him.
They talked about that man, Jesus. And then he listened to that, and he said, Jesus, oh yeah, that's a man who, he knew about the sunrise and the sunset, and the flowers, and the trees, and the fish, and the storm. He was very close to nature, to the environment. So he was a guy like us. And I think that's why the Denis people here, you know, accepted the Jesus message quite easily.
The message of the gospel strikes a universal chord among some of the Denis. It's a connection between two radically different worlds. Most of the Oblates are from France. They're fueled by a conviction that the new world needs saving from itself. The missionaries are so eager to get into the field that many lack proper training. In France, they are regarded as the Jesuits for the peasants, virtuous, but not particularly well-grounded in theology. In Canada, their enthusiasm is welcome.
It's a very basic and elementary form of evangelism. I mean, he's trying to teach the Our Father or the Hail Mary. These missionaries are not necessarily people who are the best theologians in the world. I mean, they knew their catechism and they knew the basic teachings, but don't try and get too far with that. I mean, and they felt that they really didn't need it anyways. So the idea was to get in touch with the native people and to pray with them and to tell them, you know, what the good things were, and that's it.
Ave, Ave, Ave Maria, Ave, Ave, Ave Maria.
He says that's the way that the missionary had prayed with them. They said he showed them how to pray the rosary, and then he sang this song, Ave Maria, and so they started calling him Father Ave. Father Ave.
Joe Boots is 90 years old. The first time he laid eyes on an Oblate missionary was in the year 1916.
And this one fall day, they saw a man coming down the river with a little canoe, a birch bark canoe. And as they got closer, they waved to him, and he landed by them. And he said there was this old missionary. He says he had a long beard, and he had a cross. He was somewhat pitiful. He says he was sitting in this little boat, half full of water, and he was cold. And the only thing he had in the canoe was a little birch bark basket. And he said he had a potato, a big potato in there, and he was eating slices of that. And that's how he came to them.
The missionary stays one night. Next day, he disappears down the river. The missionaries travel light. They travel alone and go far, stopping at camps like Joa's. This was the only way the Oblates could evangelize the Denis, because the families were scattered over a vast territory. The man who pioneered this mission strategy is Father Albert Lacombe. He would crisscross the prairies, becoming an itinerant missionary, a priest who travels. Originally from Quebec, Father Lacombe is part Indian himself. he quickly sees that the Indians never stay in one place for too long. They're constantly on the move, searching for food. Father Lacombe joins them for the great buffalo hunts, going where they go, preaching the gospel at every chance. Father Lacombe learns the language and the culture, making inroads where others have not.
If you think of an oblate, you think of Lacombe as the guy who, just loved what he was doing. He would travel, he felt at home, whether it would be in the teepee of a Blackfoot chief or at Rideau Hall or you name it.
Father Lacombe becomes a legend in his own time, earning the respect of the Indian people.
They certainly must have trusted him. I think one of them gave him the name, the man with the big heart. But somehow I think they felt that they could turn to Lacombe. He often interceded on their behalf, for example, if their rations were being cut off by Indian agents or things like that. More often than not, the missionaries would intercede on behalf of the Indians. And I think in a way he earned their respect.
The man with the big heart evangelizes countless numbers of Indians during almost 60 years of missionary service. The itinerant mission proves to be effective, but it's very labor-intensive. The Oblates look for easier ways to reach the people. They establish mission churches at trading posts where the people come to meet and sell their furs. In the mid-19th century, the Oblates discover an important Indian meeting place at a lake west of Edmonton in central Alberta. The Indians believe that these waters hold special healing powers. They've been gathering here since anybody can remember. The Oblates see an opportunity to evangelize large groups in a place they already have a strong spiritual connection to.
It is called in their language, in the Cree language, God's lake, or the lake of the Great Spirit, if you wish, in the Cree language as well as in the Stoney language. So there's a whole way that the Aboriginal people have been relating to that lake that goes back to time immemorial, I guess, and the sacredness of that lake and the healing powers of that lake. And it got enmeshed, it got involved with Catholic Christian tradition.
Under the stewardship of the Oblates, Lac St. Anne evolves into a Catholic pilgrimage site, drawing hundreds and eventually thousands and even tens of thousands to its shores every summer for the Feast of St. Anne. The Indians come willingly to the Oblates' doorstep, and they come in droves. By the end of the century, the ranks of the Oblates swell. They grow from just 2 men in 1845 to almost 100 by 1870, and soon that number grows to almost 300. But the frontier is changing rapidly. White settlers flock to the west. The buffalo are disappearing, as is the Indian way of life. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate step in to help.
Our motto is to work among the poor, to go to the most abandoned. Clearly, at the time when, let's say, the buffaloes were all slaughtered, that was a time of poverty, of extreme poverty. How do the missionaries serve? How do you build hospitals? People are dying. You have to find money. So the missionaries, the bishops would go to Quebec, they'd go to the States, they'd go to Europe, begging for alms.
In the Mackenzie Valley, as on the prairies, contact with the white man's world is traumatic. Epidemics of tuberculosis and flu leave the Denis reeling. They have nowhere to turn for help, but to the missionaries. The Oblates respond with orphanages, hospitals, and even schools. This new focus signals a major turning point in the Oblates' mission among the Dene.
I think a major change occurred when the mission stations were built. Then the missionaries were not going anymore to the people, but the people were coming to the mission for everything: education, religious services, medical care, social help. That was a major shift, in terms of the dynamics, and a very important one.
The new dynamics feature another powerful player, the federal government. Church and state strike a joint venture that sets the Oblates of Mary Immaculate in a direction that will come back to haunt them. In the early 20th century, the Indian treaties trigger major changes in the Canadian Northwest. The treaties cast the Oblates of Mary Immaculate in two contradictory roles, as both defenders and destroyers of native culture. With a stroke of the pen, the Dene are made wards of the state under the treaty system. In Fort Ray every year, the federal Indian agent comes to dole out the annual treaty payments of $5 per head. From the outset, the Oblates are key players in the treaty negotiations that govern their sprawling frontier. The man with the big heart, Father Albert Lacombe, serves as a translator and special advisor to Treaty 8 in the late 1890s. The people look up to him. Father Lacombe thinks the treaty system might help protect the Indians from the ravages of modern society. Change comes later to the remote north, but the issues are the same. Gabriel Rene, the Bishop of the Mackenzie, is worried about the survival of the Dene. In 1921, Bishop Rene joins the Treaty 11 Commission and travels down the Mackenzie River to help broker a new deal for the Dene. Father Rene Fumoleau is an authority on the Northern Treaties, Treaty 8 and Treaty 11. In his view, Bishop Rene was guided by a desire to help the Dene, and also a desire to secure federal funding.
If he was friendly with the government would help him afterwards, to help organize better hospitals and better schools for the Aboriginal people. I think that was one of the reasons why he wanted to play that card. Say, okay, I'll travel with you, and but you'll have to remember that. There was no health services in the north. I mean, there was not one nurse and not one doctor in the north until 1910 or 1920. The first medical doctor came to Fort Smith in 1912 or 15, something like this. And from there to the Arctic coast, I mean, there was no medical doctor. And there was no school organized by the government until the late 1950s. And that was the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church which organized all the medical care and all the school system, from Fort Smith all the way to the Arctic coast.
Under the treaties, the federal government promises to take care of the Dene. Ottawa guarantees them the right to hunt and trap. But once the papers are signed, Ottawa turns its back on the North. By the 1930s, the situation among the Dene is critical. White hunters and trappers are muscling into their traditional territories. The Dene are being pushed out. Their way of life, based on hunting and trapping, is threatened. starvation, and disease prove crippling. The Denis' fate is in the hands of a government thousands of kilometers away. The man who thought Treaty 11 would help protect their way of life is furious. In 1938, Bishop Rene lashes out publicly in a feature newspaper article. He describes the white man's invasion of the Canadian Northwest as one of the blackest blots on the pages of Canadian history. He writes that it is an ugly story of greed, ruthlessness, and broken promises. Bishop Rene becomes a champion of Denis rights.
We had all the people on our side. The mission was, and the native people needed to be defended. They came to see the priest. Bishop Rene would go to Ottawa to speak for the native people, respect of their language, their culture, and so on and so forth. The defender of the native people, that was the church. The church was loved by the people. The church was powerful.
The church was guided by two goals. One was to help the Denis survive, but the other was to civilize them and construct a Catholic society in the wilderness. Education becomes a major strategy, leading to accusations, much later, that the Oblates tried to destroy Denis culture. The first school in the Mackenzie Valley actually starts out as an orphanage. Vital Grandin, the humble Oblate missionary with the bad back, asks the Sisters of Charity in Montreal to help with the orphanage. The Grey Nuns answer the call and come north to serve as teachers and nurses. On October 7th, 1867, the sisters start their first class at Fort Providence. They have 11 students. From this modest initiative, the controversial residential school era is launched. Vital Grandin gets the idea for residential schools while on a trip home to France, where he visits a reform school. He sees that the children go to school for half the day. The other half, they work doing chores. He imports this model to the Mackenzie Valley. His plan is to prepare the children for the modern world by teaching them industrial skills, but more importantly, by teaching them Catholic values.
You have to look at the school as an adjunct of the mission. And they very quickly realized that you had to do more than simply preach, because some of the contacts between missionary and Indian tribes are sporadic. And I think they very quickly came to the conclusion that it was very difficult to convert somebody who's in their 30s or 40s, right? I suppose the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But they were also, I think they also realized how impressionable the young mind is, so they could probably do better by educating children.
Educating children also costs money. For years, the Oblates rely on Catholic donations and their own sacrifice to make ends meet. With the signing of the Indian treaties, new possibilities open up. This is an important turning point. The two forces, church and state, come together on the question of education, according to historian Raymond Huell.
It's just that the circumstances are somewhat fortuitous. On the one hand, the government has the responsibility for Indian education, but doesn't have the manpower. And the Oblates have the manpower, but they don't have the money. So the two of them come together. So it becomes a joint venture with the religious groups actually running the schools and the federal government paying for it.
The Oblates finally secure steady financing to underwrite their efforts to build a model Catholic society.
With the school came some land, because we had nothing. You had no land. What are you going to do? So came some land and some farmland. So with the farms, then you've got some milk, you've got some meat, and you can survive. And at the same time, you can produce, you can offer, or you can provide for the students, as well as for the missionaries. So it was a way, sort of an economical way of providing for the mission, and at the same time as to provide education.
A team of nuns, oblate priests, and brothers goes to work. The brothers are oblates who have not taken priestly vows, but they're driven by the same divine imperative. They work their fingers to the bone, convinced they are performing a beautiful service for the children.
They were agents of our society, but they were encouraged and directed by government with the full endorsement of public opinion such as it existed at the time. We were all responsible for what went on in those churches.
The little orphanage, the Bishop Vitel Grandin turns into a residential school, becomes a sprawling complex capable of accommodating dozens of children. The mission boat collects the children from remote camps along the Mackenzie River and deposits them in Fort Providence, in a world they've never seen before. Some of the kids are only 4 years old. They've never been away from their families. Many have never slept in a bed before, or showered, or even seen a set of stairs. Brothers and sisters are separated. Discipline is rigorous.
What the native people found out is that the missionaries also required a total cultural transformation of the native people. And otherwise you had to become civilized according to European standards. You had to cut your hair like Europeans. You had to dress like Europeans. You have to live like Europeans. You could not be a Christian without adopting the European standards.
Some of the children are traumatized by the experience and never get over it.
I think Oblates came here with good intentions, but with non-violent intentions, they practically destroy the people, the native people, by asking them to change their religion. But the missionary attacked the very soul of the native people.
At the time, the Oblates think their religion is superior. But they start to wonder if the children are really being converted, or just getting good at going through the motions of appearing Catholic. In 1935, an important visitor arrives from Rome. Theodore Labouré is the Superior General of the Oblates. He is in charge of Oblate missionary activities around the world. Theodore Labouré wants to check firsthand the work of the Canadian Oblates in the Indian missions. He tours the residential schools and is alarmed at what he finds. Historian Raymond Huell.
Labouré, I think, correctly identified the residential schools as the tail that was wagging the dog. That the schools had become an end unto themselves, that this was not in keeping with the vow of poverty and humility.
Theodore Labouré warns his Canadian colleagues that they are losing their way and losing sight of their founder's vision.
And so in 1935 he recommended, first of all, that the Oblates leave the school, because many of them, of course, some of the missionaries would be living in the school, and so that they should go back and they should live in their missions and among their charges. And the other thing that he said was that he wanted the Oblates to go back to basics.
But the system proves harder to tear down than it was to build up. The affairs of church and state are deeply entangled. The Oblates don't want to let go of the children or the federal funding that helps sustain their mission efforts. The government doesn't want the responsibility, even though it is theirs. For the Denis, the only way their children can get an education is to go to residential school and live there year-round.
The regret would be that as this develops, again it becomes an institution. So much revolved around the residential school. And I don't know, I'm not there to say whether it could have been otherwise. Because if we wouldn't have gotten involved with education, we would be the first to be blamed and to keep the people in ignorance. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
By 1945, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate hit a milestone, marking 100 years of mission work in the Canadian Northwest. In Europe, the Second World War is over, and the daunting task of rebuilding begins. Life in the missions is far removed from these events. Little has changed since the first Oblates arrived here.
This is the home of the Eskimos, the Inuit, the raw meat eaters. These are God's children of the tundra and the sea ice that stretch across the top of the world. These are the Chippewan, Cree, Dog Rib, and Slave Indians, who at last are coming out of their wild, cold haunts of paganism into the sunlight and warmth of Christianity. These are Christ's other sheep.
These images are captured on film during the 1940s by William Lysing, a young American Oblate priest. He falls in love with the Mackenzie Valley and the people who live here, taking a 16mm camera wherever he goes. Father Lysing makes a film entitled Arctic Missions of the Mackenzie. It offers a unique lens into the Oblates world. In New York, Francis Cardinal Spellman sees an opportunity to shine a public light on the Oblates' work and to entice new recruits to the Catholic frontier. Cardinal Spellman is flanked by the young filmmaker, Father Lysing, and a representative from the Society for the Propagation of the Faith.
My prayer is that it may inspire others of our youth to take up the burden of labor in Christ's vineyard. The harvest is great. The workers are few. I ask you to hearken to see if Christ is knocking at the door of your heart.
The boys and girls, smiling through their snow tans, will long remember this day. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost descend upon them and remain with them forever.
The Lysing film shows the world as the Oblates saw it. It captures their views and attitudes towards the people in Canada's north. But for many Denis, the reality was a far cry from the one portrayed here by the missionaries.
When I was 5 years old, we had a family camp down the river, about 30 miles. I was sent for, I guess, by the priest in charge here. and I was picked up by 2 dog teams, one local guy, and the other dog team was by the RCMP at 5 years old, and I fought all the way and cried all the way, and I was delivered to the mission school.
Before the arrival of the sisters, the Indian children were taught little more than the art of snaring rabbits and spearing fish. Young Johnny Beaver would much rather be out chasing squirrels on this glorious spring morning. His fingers are much more apt with a slingshot than with a pencil. But Sister is patient, and Johnny, like Barkus, is willing.
I think it's really dehumanizing, and I think it reflects an attitude that reflected the belief that we were not human, that we were subhuman.
An approved grammar school curriculum with emphasis not only on the secular sciences, the French and English languages, hygiene and other manual arts, but more specifically on that Christian and Catholic culture which is designed to cultivate character, are the seeds which the sisters are now planting in these young hearts.
It was about removing people from their culture with the idea that would increase their chances of being successful in a modern day, fully immersed in English and white men's culture.
Cabbages, carrots, and turnips are planted and cultivated by the fathers and brothers. And after the first light frost, the sisters and Indian children of the schools pitch in gladly to gather the fruits of this Arctic harvest. In a good year, this mission at Fort Resolution has produced 550 bushels of potatoes. Father Charles Gillis, who is now a long way from his home in Milwaukee, lends a little moral support here to the turnip toppers.
In the residential schools, 2 worlds are thrust together under one roof. The school experience becomes part of the fabric of Northern life. Terry Villeneuve didn't like it at first because she was punished for speaking her own language. Government regulations required that instruction be in English or French. But she learned to adjust.
It was difficult at first, but I must say that through the years, I had good experience. I don't ever remember regretting being in there. And in fact, I think there are times when I wanted to be in there. Because them days, it wasn't like now. Our parents, our relatives were very, very strict. So being in residential school didn't make any difference.
For some, the schools offered security with 3 meals a day and a bed. The education, although basic, gave children the chance to learn to read and write. These would be necessary skills in the modern world. But for others, the experience was alienating and traumatic.
They treated us really rough. I believe in discipline, but they've gone way over the line, and it just became sheer abuse of power, of control, and it was just horrible.
The residential schools are the cornerstones for these miniature city-states. There are 3 oblate-run schools in the Mackenzie Valley District, at Fort Providence, Aklavik, and at Fort Resolution. By the middle of the 20th century, the Oblates are the unofficial government. They run hospitals, schools, and farms, boats, and even airplanes. They control virtually every aspect of community life.
At one point, I would say, in the life of the North, the church was the biggest establishment. They were the economic force. They were like the government. And in terms of psychological force, too, over the people, they were dominant. They were here to look after you if you got sick. They were here to educate the young. They were here to give you a spiritual, I was going to say guidance, but they were here to give you mass, to give you church service. Again, the feeling is of domination, of absolute control.
To carry the teachings of Christ to the end of the earth, this is the beautiful and sacred privilege of the missionary. Mary, Mother of Jesus, remember these people. Be mindful of the darkness in which some of them still live.
The Oblates thought they were leading the people out of darkness and into the light of Catholic society, a society built on the foundation of the residential schools by men deeply dedicated to this vision.
The mission schools, where they have worked and given the best of themselves and worked like slaves, because they worked hard to build and run and make things possible, cutting like 400 or 500 cords of wood every winter so there would be heat, fishing 15,000 fish so that the kids would have something to eat. And they say, I've done that for 40 years. And look today, what they say about residential schools. My life has been wasted. So if they look at it from a human point of view, it's absolutely discouraging. And they feel that they are betrayed, that their life has not been worth anything, that is being even destructive. So they have to transfer to the spiritual level where God sees what they have done, what they have accomplished, their intentions, and the final analysis, He is the judge of what they have done.
The 1960s come in like a lamb, but will go out like a lion. In the Mackenzie Valley, the winds of change threaten to envelop the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. One of the first signs that the old order is crumbling comes from Rome itself. The Roman Catholic Church heralds a new policy of openness with Vatican II. The Pope declares it's time for the Church to throw open its windows and let the fresh air in. Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger arrives in Montreal fresh from the Vatican Council. He brings news of a new kind of church, a church of the people.
Non pas avec un esprit nouveau, mais fortifié dans cet esprit pastoral.
Church leaders talk about a new, strong pastoral spirit. But the Oblates are not sure what's expected of them now with this new liberal theology.
They used to know exactly what they wanted to do. They used to know exactly where they stood in relation to everybody else, that is, on top of the heap. We had the truth and the others didn't, and all of this. They don't know this anymore.
Many of the Oblates are confused. They're used to structure and a prescribed way of doing things. That's all shifting.
It's no longer Latin that is used for other liturgy all over the world to signify unity. All of a sudden, we're open to the vernacular. And so it's getting out of that sort of a one way of thinking and opening up to new possibilities, to endless possibilities. And all of a sudden there's a whole new quest for truth.
In the Mackenzie Valley, a handful of Oblates sets out on a new quest for truth. Father Camille Pichet is one, Rene Fumoleau is another. Father Fumoleau was ordained a priest under the old conservative church. Born in 1926, he grew up in France during World War II. By the end of the war years, he decides to become a missionary and to leave Europe.
I didn't join the Oblates because they were going to the poorest mission. I joined because they were coming to northern Canada. I didn't want to go to Africa, and I didn't to the warm countries, and I didn't want to stay in France. So I asked, is there any congregation in the order that sends missionaries to the cold countries? They said, yes, the Oblates. I said, okay, I'll join the Oblates. It was like that.
Almost 50 years later, Rene Fumoleau can look back on a remarkable career as a missionary, historian, a writer and photographer, and as a friend of the Denis.
When I came to the land of the Denis, I asked somebody, I don't know where it was, but said, what we have to be careful. I said, what do I need to know? And somebody told me, well, basically, you need three things. And he said the first one is patience, and the second is patience, and the third one is patience. So that's the advice I got. And even with that, sometimes I'm sure I wasn't too patient.
When Father Fumoleau arrives in Fort Good Hope in 1953, he doesn't speak a word of Denis or a word of English. He speaks French, and on Sundays, he gives the Mass in Latin. For Rene Fumoleau, life near the Arctic Circle is much the same as it was during the days of the missionary pioneers. The missionaries still travel by dog team and camp with the Denis. While some of the children are sent away to schools, the rest of the family remains on the land. Like the old itinerant missionaries, Father Fumoleau preaches the gospel wherever he can. He didn't change overnight. It was a process. He recalls explaining the idea of sin and the 10 Commandments to a Denis family, and asking them what they thought.
And they talked it over in their own language, which I didn't understand, and finally one person volunteered to interpret, to translate for me, what they had decided, and he said, well, we just talked it over, and we all agree that the worst sin that people can make is to lock the door to their house. And I said, I decided that I realized that I had to change my own theology and everything that I had learned before to relearn everything new.
This experience would open his eyes to a different world. As a priest, he would start to listen. As a writer, he would describe his impressions in books of poetry. As a photographer, he would start to see the Denis with a new lens. Rene Fumoleau discovers another world during a time of profound change in the North. The 1960s is a decade fueled by new money and new politics. The catalyst is the oil and gas industry. The new economy affects everyone in the Mackenzie Valley. Ottawa decides to get into the action after years of acting like an absentee landlord. Power and control slips out of the hands of the Oblates.
What happened is the federal government and the territorial government became more involved in areas that the church had been involved in, like hospitals. At one point, the government decided to become more involved in the care and hospitalization of people. So they took over in terms of school too, public schools. The government became more involved in this aspect, in these institutions. And so in a sense, the church no longer was needed, or they were forced out.
The Oblates slowly let go of the key institutions that have defined their mission for decades. The old residential schools are phased out and shut down. Public schools and public hospitals are built. It's a transition period, lasting almost 3 decades, as the federal government finally assumes responsibility for all aspects of community life. The Oblates are faced with a big question: how to serve as missionaries in this new world.
That transition period was from 55 on, and that's where the church, we had to find a new identity. It was very difficult for the church to let go, because we knew we were losing a means of evangelization. Once you don't have the schools, you don't have the young people.
As the Oblates struggle to find their way, the Denis also struggle. There's just too much change all at once. In the early 60s, the Mackenzie Highway is pushed through, linking the village of Fort Ray to the outside world for the first time. Before the road, the mail would come 10 times a year by airplane. In the 60s, it starts coming 3 times a week by bus. This is only one small indication of how fast their world is moving. In Fort Ray, there is a critical shortage of housing, and dozens of families are in dire need of help. Father Camille Pichet, a new brand of missionary, searches for different ways to respond to the need.
I remember one particular poor family, 9 children, miserable. Seeing that family of 9 children in a tent in 60 degrees below, like Ray can be really cold. And at that moment, I made a resolve that I could not exercise my ministry simply by preaching in the chapel. I was willing to do that, but that somehow the needs of this family needed to be met.
Father Pichet develops a cooperative strategy for housing by working with the Denis and helping them to find their own solutions.
And I thought to myself, if I'm going to build Christian community here, it doesn't make sense. I cannot build Christian community if we don't have a community that is healthy in the first place. So I immediately got involved with cooperative development. So you respond to the needs and to the needs of the people, and they're the ones that have to take ownership of that. And my help was to be of service to them.
Father Pichet's approach to mission is difficult for the bishop and some of his colleagues to understand. They've spent their whole lives working with the Denis in a paternalistic way. A rift develops between old and new.
Like I had tacit support from the bishop and from the other priests, but really not connecting with that. That they saw that as being sort of outside of ministry, and I don't think they knew too much what I was doing.
Like Camille Pichet, Rene Fumoleau quietly goes about his work. Father Fumoleau is excited by what he sees happening in the late 1960s. Small cooperatives are springing up independently all over the north. The Denis start to organize politically.
And then it happened one meeting in Fort Smith when the Department of Indian Affairs used to gather the chiefs from the 16 communities in those days and brief them on what the government wanted to do, for the next year or so. And the chiefs listened there and said yes, until one day in '69, after the first meeting in the morning, And Denis stood up, a woman stood up and said, well, you people of Indian Affairs, we don't need you this afternoon. We're going to meet by ourselves. And I mean, that was a bomb. I mean, nobody even 2 years earlier would have ever believed or thought that such a thing could be possible.
This land's ours. We know that we're Denis, and we live according to that.
The 1970s is the decade the Denis take charge. They become a political force to be reckoned with. They want control over their destiny and answers about the past. Father Rene Fumoleau is in Fort Providence the night things come to a head. He's meeting with a group of Denis and some of his Oblate colleagues when the challenge is issued over Treaty 11. The question: did the Oblates sell out the Denis in their dealings with the government?
And we started to argue across the table, especially about the role of Bishop Rene, who was involved during the treaty making, and said he's a good guy. No, he said, just sold us out. No. So we argued about Treaty 11, and that treaty is no good, and what it says is no good, until somebody said, oh, did you read Treaty 11, the text? No. Did you read it? No. And we discovered that not one of us were arguing, with so much heat. Not one of us had ever read the text of Treaty 11. So we said, well, we should do some research on that.
Rene Fumoleau sets out to write his famous historical account of the treaty making. As long as this land shall last. His book becomes an important resource for the Denis. They use the information in it to launch their land claims. The 1970s is also the decade that many Canadians become aware of the Mackenzie Valley. A consortium of oil and gas companies announces plans to build a pipeline from the Beauport Sea to thirsty markets in the south. The pipeline would go through the land of the Denis. The federal government appoints Justice Thomas Berger to hold an inquiry into the Mackenzie Valley pipeline.
We've listened to sociologists and anthropologists, all of them white, telling us what the native people think and what the native people believe, what their hopes and aspirations are. And I think that the views of both of these groups have to be taken into account. But the most important opinions are those expressed to this inquiry by the native peoples themselves at the community hearings.
For the rest of my childhood, I was raised in Cove Lake. I don't want my people to have nothing but memories, of what their life used to be. That's why we want control of what's going to happen to us in our lives, in the future.
A committed group of church activists, including Rene Fumoleau, swings behind the Denis' efforts for social justice and control.
That was beautiful. Because there were people waking up, taking responsibility for themselves, and that there were people who had the right to stand on their own 2 feet and make decisions for themselves, the right to self-determination.
So we have to stand strong.
As the Denis rediscover who they are and what they want, many of the Oblate missionaries who thought they knew all about them look on with shock. The rise of the Denis nation rocks their world.
That was a major shock for many missionaries, because they said they were convinced all those things were gone, that Aboriginal peoples would integrate in larger society, and there we see like a real turn. The First Nations started occupying the center stage in politics. It was not something internal to the church, but something that came from the people and the new political, cultural situation of First Nations.
As the Dene nation gains strength, the Oblates lose strength. Their numbers slide, the older ones retire. Trouble is, fewer men are joining the priesthood. In 3 short decades, the Oblates go from 100 strong in the Mackenzie Valley to a mere handful on active duty. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Oblates struggle with their new reality. The problem of recruitment is soon overshadowed by a more disturbing one. The legacy of the residential schools comes back to haunt the Oblates. Revelations of physical and sexual abuse surface. Bishop Denis Croteau is one of the few left to shoulder the burden and to search for answers and solutions.
Unless the student comes to tell me, hey, this is what is taking place, then I should move, okay. But often students, out of fear, never spoke a word. So how is the director to know that it's taking place? So it's always a question of secrecy against revelation, and unless revelation takes place, there is nothing you can do. But when it takes place, then you have in conscience to move on it. That's my position.
Bishop Croteau has allocated hundreds of thousands of dollars to healing programs in the last few years. In the Mackenzie Valley, the memories won't go away despite the efforts to make peace with the past. On the outside, there's barely a trace of the old days. The big, sprawling school in Fort Providence has been torn down. The hospitals are gone, and so are the mission farms. On the inside, the suffering is deep. Senator Nick Sibiston from Fort Simpson talks about surviving the past.
One may say, sure, you've been successful, but they don't know the hurt. They don't know the personal sacrifice. They don't know the sadness that I've gone through, the hurts as a result of being in residential school. It's humongous, it's huge, and a lot of people have died. A lot of people never survived that through alcoholism and drinking and other things. I survived, but it took a lot of work, and I'm still not totally healthy. You don't know the countless of hours that I spent taking healing, therapy, and I suffer from depression and sadness that I've had to deal with in my life.
I hold responsible the church and also the government for allowing this tragedy to have happened to us, and there's still a lot of anger out there.
Yet underneath the anger, there's still faith. In Fort Simpson, there's also a sense of renewal as the community takes over the mission church. With hardly any Oblate priests left in the Mackenzie Valley, local residents, including women, are allowed to lead the services.
Hear the prayers of your church and grant us today what we ask of you in faith. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
survival of the church depends on the people now. Today, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate are paying a big price for their joint venture with the federal government over the residential school system.
It's something that's going to hurt the church. It's going to hurt the people in church, but it has to come out, and it has to be, you know, maybe one day it'll come down to the point where even the church itself will go right down. But I think if that's necessary, then you know, that's the way it's going to go.
It doesn't matter what kind of ministries we have left with, or what kind of money we have. It depends. Whoever the Oblates are there, who are we going to be? I think that's the only questions. Whether we are 5 or 10 or 35 or 350, what kind of people are we going to be? Independently of what we have, what we own, the ministries we make. So that's the real question.
Red van for handicap parking.
Early on a July morning, the pilgrimage grounds at Lac St. Anne come to life. This year marks the anniversary of the birth of Christ, 2,000 years ago. It's the Christian Jubilee, a time to take stock over the past, present, and future. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate are focusing on forgiveness and reconciliation. Lac St. Anne has always been a traditional gathering place for Aboriginal Canadians. They believe the waters have special healing powers. 150 years ago, the Oblates discovered the power of Lac St. Anne and set down roots. Today, almost 40,000 Catholic pilgrims are drawn to these shores. But the Oblates simply don't have the manpower to run this event anymore.
It's impossible for us to continue. It's such a huge undertaking that just the logistics, organizing for this pilgrimage is impossible for us.
The Oblates are also preoccupied with the fallout from the residential school system. They face a wall of litigation over charges ranging from sexual abuse to spiritual abuse. Today, the Oblates are wrestling with their future as well as their past.
Just like Jesus in his agony, we are in agony. To the point where one of my priests said, when I became a bishop, "Why don't you pull the plug?" Within 10 years, the church will not be. Well, why don't you euthanasia? Apostolic euthanasia. Well, I said, no. I said, my role as a bishop is to, just like Christ, if he would have said in his agony or the cross, what the heck, I walk out, and there is no cross in my life, the world would not have been saved. And it's the same with the church.
The history of the Oblates, since their inception in France as a religious community, spans less than 200 years. This is a fraction of time in the history of the Roman Catholic Church.
We have to go through this period of purification. And I think there will be an Easter Sunday. Today is Good Friday. There will be an Easter Sunday. I'm just waiting. I might not be around, but it's coming.
The Oblates have always been like a family, united by a sense of mission. But the legacy of the residential school system has cast a long shadow, causing divisions within the family itself. Back in 1991, the Oblate leadership chose Lac St. Anne as the setting for a public apology. But there was little consultation. Many Oblates have never worked in the school system. And for others, who devoted their whole lives to the Indian missions, the apology was like a condemnation.
The older priests would say, well, we were never there to oppress the people, to kill their culture. We were there to help them, sometimes to survive. They look sometimes with lots of sadness on the history, and they feel that even by some of the Oblates who were like pushing, like for example, the apology, they were saying, well, they saw it like a condemnation by their own brothers.
How do we overcome that? For one, we have to heal. Sure, the word healing is in every pot and sauce today. But healing, what do we mean by healing? I think we have to forgive and be forgiven.
Yet knowing that thousands of former students are turning to the courts is hardening attitudes. That's what Father Guy Lavallée finds among his peers in Manitoba.
99% of the answers are negative. Things like, well, this is all fabricated stories. It's only the lawyers who want money. Oh, the Indians are after us. They become our public enemy number one. If that's the way the Indians are going to treat the Oblates, I don't want to have anything to do with them anymore. They can get somebody else. You'll never see me go and work with the Indians anymore. It's going to take a long time. That mentality that was brought here is still with us today. You can't change the white man into an Indian or an Indian to a white man. They're both themselves. And until they recognize each other for who they are, according to their culture, their history, their future, well, won't go anywhere.
Father Rene Fumoleau, for one, is at peace with the past. He has chosen to retire among the Denis in Lutzelkay, a remote village accessible only by air or water. Father Fumoleau rarely goes to church anymore. He's happy and at home here on the shores of Great Slave Lake.
I'm happy, yes I am. And I think I'm still an oblate, and I am proud of it too. I cannot say I need to go to church. Finally, every person is responsible to himself or to herself, not to a system, not to any organization, and not to any government, not to any rule. People are responsible to themselves. And I think that's what Jesus was about, make people responsible for themselves. Personally, I don't think that God worries very much about what's happening in Canada or with the Oblates.
About 150 years ago, the first missionaries came to Canada with a fire in their bellies. They were inspired by the vision of their founder, Eugene de Maisonneuve, to go forth and baptize all nations, and especially to help the poor.
May Almighty God have mercy on us, forgive us our sins, and bring us to life everlasting. Amen. We give our God.
It's difficult to measure the success of the Oblates in Canada's north. They spread the gospel and converted souls. They built churches and hospitals, then schools. They changed the north forever, but the north also changed them.
That the massive movement of the Oblates to the west and to the north had its time, had its day, and served its purpose, hopefully. We don't, as Oblates, we don't look on that past only with regrets. There are some things that we can regret, but by and large, These men were sincere, they were ardent, they were passionate men. My whole ministry has been exercised in the context of rapid and profound societal changes in the Northwest Territories. I feel very, very privileged to have been able to be part of that.
A special Mass gets underway. Bishop Gerald Wiesner prepares to deliver the homily. He is the president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. The Oblates are worried about going bankrupt because of their escalating court costs.
We believe that Jesus is present here.
Bishop Wiesner focuses on reconciliation. At one point, he appeals to the congregation and asks them not to seek revenge against the Church.
If we have caused the hurts, if we have caused the wounds, knowingly or unknowingly, willingly or unwillingly, we need to ask forgiveness. And if we feel that we have been hurt, that we've been wounded, that we've been scarred, we need to forgive. Revenge, suing others for money, will not bring healing. It will not bring peace. It will not bring the unity in the community that everyone so deeply desires. Without forgiveness, there is no future.
The Oblates don't have the men or the money to run their own missions anymore.
And with Mother Earth.
They are passing the torch to the Aboriginal people. Here at Lac St. Anne, the Oblates strike a new partnership to own and operate the pilgrimage together. To make this official, they enter into a covenant. The covenant is written on goatskin and laid out on a small table for the signatories to witness and sign. With the dawn of a new millennium, the Oblates are searching for meaning, something to rekindle the Catholic flame ignited by their founder many years ago, something to guide them and their mission in a very different world.
Maybe we need a new type of oblate. Maybe we need a new oblate with a new vision, with a new spirituality, a new expression of the oblate spirituality. This is what we need. If Eugene was living today, he'd tackle that, I'm sure. He used to say, I don't want any smoldering wicks among you oblates. I want you to give heat, and I want you to give light, or get out. That's what Eugene told the Oblates. And I'm sure he would say the same thing today.